My name is Penelope Blissett. Most people call me Penny, which is my nickname. I was actually born here in New Albany, Mississippi. Not at the hospital here in New Albany, but the hospital in Tupelo. Was born and raised here. My parents is Robert Augusta Johnson, the late Bob Johnson of Mosley and Johnson, and my mother is Lily Bell Knox Johnson. I have two siblings. That is Sarah Lynn Thomas. She lives in Jackson, Mississippi. And my other sister is Tanya Nesbitt, and she lives here in New Albany. I am the wife of Kelvin Blissett. He is from Winona, Mississippi, and we have two children. We have three children. We have three children. My two oldest ones, Evan and Nylan Blissett, they actually commute and live in Oxford, Mississippi. And my youngest, which is Chandler Blissett, keeps us very busy, and he is a junior here at New Albany High School.
Tell me your earliest memories of your dad.
Oh, wow. So I was born January 27, 1974, and I'm 51 years old. And so my earliest memory of my dad would be, there's a picture, and in this picture my dad is standing there. He's got on his actually it's a green suit, and in this suit is actually the photo that they took for their album, and I'm being held what appears to be like another man, so I'm assuming that was probably Sam, and they're standing out in front of my mom's house, and they're getting ready, because 9 out of 10 times when they were getting ready to go for different shows or to go play and stuff, they actually left from our house. That is where the bus, I remember my dad and them having a big Greyhound type bus that would park out in front of our house, and so that's where all the band members would come. Sam would come over, and then they would leave from there. So that's the earliest memory that I have of my dad and watching him getting ready.
How old do you think you were?
In the picture, I have on these white hard bottom shoes, so I'm thinking I must have been maybe 1, 2, learning how to walk.
Okay. So where was this house?
We live down the street from the high school, which is on Wheeler Street. That's where my parents have lived. That is where my mother lives currently right now.
So that's where all the band members would show up there.
All the band members would basically show up there, unless, say, for example, like if they were going on a trip and it was headed toward Tupelo, Mississippi, well, the band members that were in Tupelo would just meet them there. But if they were going long distance to, like, I remember them going to St. Louis, I remember them going to different locations out of state, then yes, they would come to our house, they would all meet up there, and then they would load on the bus.
Now, was this bus like the kind you could sleep on?
It was. It was.
So there would be probably how many guys?
The band was pretty much made up of males, but there was a female. I remember, matter of fact, 3 different musicians, female musicians. And so Doris Beatty would be the first female that I recall, and that, yes, she would be one of the guests that was on the band on the bus. So you would have anywhere from like 5 to 8 to 10 people on the bus, and they all interacted together. I remember not just them going on band trips or music trips, but my dad would sometimes just take us, and when I say us, the family, on the bus, and we would go to Tupelo or somewhere of that nature. So it was kind of fun being this little kid on the bus with my sisters and riding on this big Greyhound bus, which was basically Mosley and Johnson's band.
As you got older and you have more memories of your dad, do you remember much about his creative process? Like, would you have ever been in the room when he might be writing?
Yes. So most of my dad's creative work was done at 111 Wheeler Avenue where we lived. We had a room off to the living room, which basically was my dad's studio. And so that's where he would actually do all of his writing. That's where he would lay down some of the tracks before they would go to there's 2 locations that my dad and Sam would go to do their actual recording, and that was in Jackson, Mississippi, to Malaco Recording Studio, and then they would go to Muscle Shoals, which was in Alabama. And so, but all of the pre-work that he did it there at the house. And then his other place of studio, I would say, would be his truck. My dad was a truck driver. He drove for multiple companies. He was driving for Walmart when he passed away. But my dad kept some type of instrument in his hand, whether it was a guitar or whether it was his keyboard. And so his other studio was his cab of his truck. And that's where he pretty much spent a lot of his time. I also remember my dad as a truck driver. He did not just do single driving, but he did double driving. So that's kind of where Zeke Listenby dad came into play, because I remember they used to team drive together. And so they did a lot of writing, a lot of going back and forth on understanding the transitioning of music. My dad pretty much did not have formal training of music. He learned by ear, and he played by ear, and he played by numbers. And so Zeke's dad would actually, he understood chords. So he would go back and forth with Zeke's dad in understanding how to play music by chords.
When you talk about him not having a formal training in music, what was his, do you know what his first musical introduction would have been, when he was a kid? What was his beginning?
So I remember him telling us about when he went off to the military, and that I don't know if the first instrument that came along was the guitar or the bass. But I did have someone to share with me that when my dad left the military and came back to New Albany, my dad came to a location where this group was playing. And anyway, he had his bass guitar with him. And so he was like, hey, can I play with you? Anyone who knew Robert Johnson knew that he did not meet a stranger. He did not meet a stranger no matter where he was. And so he was like, hey, can I play with you all? And so this particular band did not have a bass guitar and had never heard or seen a bass guitar. So he pulls out this bass guitar, and it literally, he talks about, his name is Mr. Stacy, and he said that when he made the first chord on the bass guitar, it shook the entire building. And they was like, oh yeah, you can come play with us. And so I would say that his first instrument had to have been either the guitar or the bass guitar. But then going to later on in the years, I was told about how my dad learned how to play the keyboard. And anyone who knows my dad is a businessman. He was a businessman to heart. And if you say you're going to do something, his expectation is that you do what you say you're going to do. And so they was having some difficulties with people showing up for practice or being on time to prepare. My dad always liked to have been prepared for his different shows and things like that. And so they was having some difficulties with the keyboard player doing his responsibilities. So my dad tells Sam, you know what? We're not going to be responsible for anyone else. We are going to make sure that we have everything we need. And so that's how my dad ended up teaching himself how to play the keyboard, because he wanted to know that when he went on trips, he was not having to depend on someone else, that he had everything he needed to perform.
Just in case he could play the keyboard and play guitar, they could make it.
Absolutely. So I laugh about that, because literally in my dad's studio at home, my dad was not only able to play the keyboard, but he was able to play the keyboard, he was able to play the guitar, he was able to play the drums. So everything that you needed as a musician, my dad actually could do it. Now, I think the one thing that I loved about him, and especially when I hear the different stories of different musicians that came along, is that my dad wanted to give other people opportunities. And so he would invest in individuals learning the different things. So I've heard about him buying people drums. I've learned about him buying people microphones. I remember his latest female musician, he took her to I think it was Florida, because she wanted to record, and so my dad did everything he could to make sure that she could get a recording deal. And so he took her, and if I'm not mistaken, I think it was Florida, for her to go. And then Zeke Listenby talks about him getting his first equipment from my dad. My dad always wanted to make sure that he invested in others for them to be successful.
He was a teacher.
He was. He was.
What about, let's talk about your dad as a vocalist.
So my dad, he actually wrote and he actually performed. Now, most people think of Sam and Bob, Mosley and Johnson, as them being the singers. But I have to be honest, the conversations that my dad had as I got older is that he loved the producing side. Going in with Johnny Taylor, B.B. King, Denise LaSalle, Bobby Rush, all of those famous artists, because he could sing. I wonder sometimes, where did he get that singing talent? Because his siblings, I don't believe any of them can sing. But I think that it was just my dad. He was a man that wanted to hone in on his skills. So he taught himself a lot of things. And he actually sung on perfect key, which is funny because my middle son, I noticed that when he was little and we were riding the car, he had perfect tone or perfect pitch. And so my dad did as well. So I think it's just something that he just picked up. And I think it's just a talent that he had.
How old were you when your dad passed away?
So my dad passed away. Trying to think how old I would have been. So I'm 51, and my dad passed away in 98. So what is that difference? I think I might have been 24, 23. Because I was, at the time, I wasn't married. He didn't have any grandchildren at the time that he passed away.
So you were a full-grown adult. You have all the memories. I was older than 21. And the reason why that age stands out to me is because I was in a car accident. And in the car accident, I spent a lot of time in the hospital in Oxford. And so my dad, being a truck driver, he actually would go on the road and he would come in on Thursday. And so basically from Thursday to Sunday was my time with just me and my dad. And so I was turning 21 when I had my accident, and my dad passed away 4 years later. And those 4 years was probably the best time of my life, spending that with my dad. What do you think your dad taught you?
He taught me how to be a businesswoman. I think that if my dad had his choice, he would have had a boy out of the family, but he had 3 girls and then he had my mom, so he was surrounded by females. And so my dad always wanted to entrust that he equipped us to be knowledgeable about what we were doing. Be about, if we say we're going to do something, make sure that we do it to the fullest and we do it correctly. And so understanding that Sam loved playing He was a performer, and if Sam could have continued that, he would have done that. But my dad pretty much was one that wanted to do the business side. He was the contract reader. He was the one that managed to make sure that the contracts were written right, that it was not in the favor of the business, but that it was in the favor of Mosley and Johnson and the people that were around him. So I would say that would be the thing that sticks out to me. When I decided to go to college, my dad asked me what did I want to do, and I told him, I said, well, I want to make sure that I be successful, and not just successful in my own right, but back to my family. And so we looked at different options. And so I have an associate's degree in accounting, and then I also have business administration. And so the goal of that was to be able to manage the business so that he could handle, the other portion of producing and going in and getting the contracts and making sure that they was written right. And then, Sam making sure that the music was on point.
You talked about his friendship with Zeke's dad, and who also passed at a young age.
He did.
Tell me more about their musical relationship.
Oh gosh. So Zeke's dad, Willie, my dad and him spent a lot of time together, which I could probably say that about everybody my dad knew, because if he entrusted his friendship with you, he spent a lot of time with you. And so Zeke's dad and my dad spent a lot of time, whether my dad was over to his house or if Willie was over to our house, because their common bond was music. And I remember a lot of people think that only music that my dad played was blues. Our house literally had country music, blues, R&B, you named it. If it was music, it was in our house. And so one of the things that Zeke dad, he pretty much played gospel. And so my dad played gospel, blues, whatever. I tell people all the time, a C chord in blues is a C chord in gospel. It doesn't matter. A C chord is a C chord. And so they would talk music for hours on hours, whether he was at the house or on the telephone, or they were in the truck together.
Wouldn't you like to have heard them in the truck together?
Oh gosh, I can just only imagine what those conversations were. I mentioned earlier that my dad didn't have any boys. It was all girls. I think I pretty much was the closest one to my dad. Many people will tell you I was probably attached to my dad's hip, because where he went, I went, especially when I got older. I remember going to what was called the dugout. And people may say, Penny, you weren't old enough to be at the dugout. No, I wasn't old enough to be at the dugout. And I wasn't there during the parties, but I was there when my dad would be setting up or if they were practicing. And so when I think about that, I remember also him having many, many conversations with Coach Kennedy. And Coach Kennedy was my godfather, and I remember them talking, and Coach Kennedy was such a man that talked about business and being effective in your community. And so hearing all of those conversations, I probably could actually tell you what I heard in every conversation with Sam or Coach Kennedy or Mr. Ivy or anybody that he was ever with, because I was so close to my dad. So the only time I probably didn't hear the conversations was either when they was at the studio and I was too young to go, or if he was in the truck.
When they would perform locally and you could go and be there when they were setting up. I guess I'm thinking more as a child, but what do you remember about that whole setting up process?
So my first memory of my dad and them playing in the community publicly is that they played, and I don't know what event it was, but it was in the parking lot of where the library is, where the Union County Library is, and there's this big, large parking lot. And they used to bring the flatbeds of 18-wheelers, and then that's where my dad and them would perform. And so this particular year or event, and I've been meaning to go back to look to see what year that was, I was able to actually, my dad put me on stage. So my dad is sitting behind me, sitting at his keyboard, and I'm sitting at the edge of the stage. And I just remember looking out and seeing just as far as you could look in the city of New Albany, it was just people. But prior to that, them setting up Crow and Larry and Pistol, those were some of the key band members, and they would go and they would make sure that everything was set up, and they would check the mics and things like that, because when my dad and Sam came on stage, they would do their mic checks. And if you know my dad was very meticulous about, he wanted the sound to be right. He wanted every instrument to be in its place, and he hated to be late for anything. So it was always a fun time watching all of them put everything together, and that being meticulous about how it was set up, because when my dad and Sam hit the stage, they knew they was going to put on a show for the city or whoever they were performing for.
Do you remember, did they ever wear like special suits or
Yes.
costumes, I guess? I guess they're not really called costumes, but in the era of bands wearing these flashy costumes, do you remember them ever doing that?
I do. Matter of fact, there's probably a couple of uniforms, and I'll call them uniforms, that stands out to me. There was one that was, it was gray. It was a jacket, pants, bell bottoms, and then inside of the bottom of the pants leg, it opened up and it was red, so that when they would either pad or move, their big legs would of the pants would move, and so you would see this flashy red coming outside of this gray. That was one of their uniforms. And then the other uniform that I remember them wearing was like a dashiki, and it's funny that that was probably like in the early 70s that I remember this uniform, and that I see it now. People wear that same type of print now. I have a friend that makes African clothing, and one of those prints, the kente cloth print that she does, was one of the ones that they wore as well. The old posters, the advertising for upcoming shows and stuff. Do you remember who would have designed those for them? I do not, and that's a very good question. One of the things that I would love to be able to do is to go back and look and research. Like, I know a lot of the articles was done by the Living Blues magazine, but a lot of their posters and things like that, to see who that was credited to, because your advertisement, that's how that was done. It was had these big, matter of fact, we have a couple at our house that's in frame of the different shows that they would play at. And I remember one of them in particular was the Elks Lodge. They played a lot there in Tupelo and in the surrounding area of the Elks Lodge, and they would have those big signs. So I don't know what company was credited for doing that, but I think it's a really good point of research that needs to be done.
It more than likely was just the print shop.
Could have been.
Mm-hmm. There's probably somebody it could have been here, New Albany.
Absolutely.
I don't know. That was probably just somebody's job. They printed all the band posters.
Absolutely.
Tell me about your mom's role in all of this.
So to know my mom is to know that she is a behind the scenes person. The music portion of it, that was my dad. She would fuss with my dad because he would come in from truck driving, and then he would either have to go to a show, and if he wasn't at a show, he was practicing. Anyone who knows that when you're trying to build a business or you're trying to learn your skills, is that you got to practice. So my mom would fuss, my dad, you're just always in the music, you're always in there performing. But I think now, as time has gone on, and to see how successful that my dad and Sam was, is that I'll share this. As a little girl, my dad used to tell me that my job was answering the telephone at the house. And so I would answer the telephone anytime it would ring. And to have like B.B. King, Bobby Bland, Johnny Taylor call our residency asking, oh, can I speak to Bob? At that time, it never really dawned on me that here it is, these famous people are calling our house and wanting to speak to my dad. And I remember my dad taking me to Malico Studio. And whenever we would go, this is as I got older, we went to Malico, and I believe it was I think it was Johnny Taylor was getting ready to produce a new album. And whenever he went into the recording studio, he specifically asked, is Bob Johnson, is he going to be in the place? Because I need him to be in the studio to make sure that it sounds right. And him and Sam would be there. And a lot of times, because Sam had a full-time job, my dad did as well. But my dad's schedule was kind of flexible. Him being a truck driver, he could kind of maneuver his work schedule where if they were going to be in the studio on Wednesdays and Thursday, then he would get a load that would go out on Friday. So we would go down to Jackson, stay at the hotel, or we would go in the studio, and here it is, my dad back in the studio. And I'm still not thinking, because he was just dad, I'm not thinking that, years from now or years later, and to look now and to see them having gold albums and things like that, and their name being household names, that would be such an amazing group that would be forever known in Union County.
What is your goal and your family's goal to preserve this legacy?
So when we talk about preserving the legacy, I have to say there is not a time except for when my dad passed away that it was not Sam and Bob. I feel like you cannot say one without the other. I think that they are not known separately. I think that they are a duo. And so when I say that, I feel like that the legacy lives on through the family of Mosley and Johnson. And so if I had, I guess, a special one to say what I would do, is that I would preserve their legacy by making sure that a museum, which here at the Union County Heritage Museum, you can hear about Mosley and Johnson. You can see about those different things that they did. However, our exhibits here at the museum are rotating. But to have something that preserves and shows their history from beginning to end. A lot of people think my dad and Sam started out together. Sam came from a little country town outside of New Albany, but my dad has always said, I'm a city boy. I don't even think my dad picked cotton. He just didn't do those things. He was about the business. And so preserving that legacy is making sure that Mosley and Johnson, and I think that is very key of that and, is to make sure that their history stays alive. And that is whether it is, I don't know, in reference to performing, because there'll never be another Mosley and Johnson. But I think as far as their music, making sure that their music is being known. I will say this, I've been contacted by a couple of companies that servicing and looking at old music and old artists, and when I say old, I'm talking about the 60s to 70s, what brought up blues, highlighting their music and remarketing their music. So that would be some of the things that I would want to do with Mosley and Johnson, is to remarket what they've done and revamp it in such a way that would be a positive way. The second thing I would think is my dad truly loved Zeke Listenby. When my dad passed away, there was some people that came in. My dad was affiliated to help making sure that last album was successfully produced. And so, but Zeke is one of the ones that he's been very successful in his own right, and I think that he gives a lot of credit back to his own dad, Mr. Listenby, and to my dad, and to Sam, and that I would love to be able to potentially do something with Zeke, and for Zeke to continue to honor that Mosley and Johnson side of his of where his roots came from. I think that for the artists today, there's not really any new creations. A lot of them are sampling from old music. I think a person was asking me the other day, did my children play any type of instruments? And my children do play instruments. All three of them were in the band at New Albany High School. But they are not performers, okay? And so with them not being performers, they have their own gifting. My middle son, I will reference to him. He's actually bought equipment where he can actually design music that he can put out, because most of the things now is either coming out through Instagram or YouTube, and they're not following the trails of the old musicians where you had to go in and write these contracts and perform and then get a musical deal. But when you're looking at that type, I think is that listening to those old music and listening to those old artists, going back to the roots and pulling that and sampling that is bringing it into light to new generation, because there's songs that my children listen to now and they think, oh, listen to this new song, and my husband and I'll be like, boy, that's not new, that was such and such, and then they'll be like, start laughing. They was like, you don't know what you're talking about, give me 5 minutes, and then we pull it up on YouTube and we like, okay, who's that? And then they was like, oh man, I didn't know that. So I think that new artists picking up on that old music and making sure not just to, because I do believe in copyright, and you shouldn't infringe on that, but I think that if you give it new light, then that next generation will then pick it up and then will take it on to that next generation.
That's good stuff. It is. I mean, it's really good. That's all true.
Mm-hmm.
That's how it works. That is how the legacy continues.
That's how the legacy continues. It's nothing. When you think about legacy is nothing new. You go back to the beginning and you just reformat it in a way that is enticing to the new generation. And I think that's the reason why we have to get to the point where we start developing the next generation. When I talked about a C chord in gospel is a C chord in blues, and I know that there's sometimes these big arguments about, oh, you don't play blues if you play Christian music because that's of the devil and all of that. No, music, the gift of music comes from God, no matter on what side it is. It's how you use it, how you utilize it. And if it is for the building of either the individual or the kingdom, I think that it's just important. And so that's where legacy comes from. We're not trying to build anything new. We're just trying to keep the things alive.